Hello, hello, hello. Welcome again into Strategies for Living here on 1017 FM and 710 KEEL. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan, all the way down at the other end of the broadcast table. There she is, grinning like a Chessy cat, our own PLPC, Carla McCormick.
Hey, Dave.
How you doing, Carla?
I'm pretty okay for a Thursday.
Well, I'm glad you're pretty okay. You look pretty okay.
Why, thank you.
You survived your big day.
My birthday bash,
And
yes.
you survived being sung happy birthday to
I
to
did.
you.
Barely.
Yes.
I just barely, Ruben, here.
And welcome our ace producer. He keeps us flying high, low, and in between, the ace of the airwaves, Rapid Ruben Wright.
Good evening, everybody.
So, guys, what do you know about meditation?
Not as much as I would like to.
Well,
Just the bare minimum.
okay, well, you're going to know a whole lot more after our life strategist gets through with all of us this evening.
Great.
We've got a great life strategist. He is Benjamin Riggs, and he's also the author of a wonderful book we're going to talk about, Finding God in the Body, A Spiritual Path for the Modern West. And he's also working on a brand new book. We'll come back and talk about that and much more here on Strategies for Living this evening. Folks, thank you for tuning in. We're presented by CADA, the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse of Northwest Louisiana, been helping individuals and families for 60 years now. Also by Milestones Counseling Center, by Jerry Anderson, State Farm Insurance, by Learning RX, by Highland Place Rehab and Nursing Center, by Jacob's Well, Inspirational Books and Gifts, and by Resilient House. Back in a moment to meet our life strategist, Benjamin Riggs, on Strategies today. Stay with us.
Did you know that weak cognitive
Welcome back in. Welcome back into 1017 FM and 710 KEEL. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan with PLPC Carla McCormick. Please welcome to the program now the author of Finding God in the Body, A Spiritual Path for the Modern West. He is the featured columnist for Elephant Journal, host of Finding God in the Body podcast, of which you can sample many on findinggodinthebody.com. Benjamin Riggs has studied Buddhism and contemplative Christianity for the past 15 years in both Christian and Buddhist monasteries in India and the United States. He lives here in Shreveport with his wife and son. So please welcome Mr. Benjamin Riggs as our life strategist here on Strategies for Living. Mr. Riggs, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So you have spent many people, and we're going to talk about the book, but I want to talk about meditation because since we've brought the program back, how many times since we've come back on daily, how many times have one author or another mentioned, recommended meditation?
Weekly.
Yeah,
easy. Maybe even daily.
And Ben, you have blazed a trail here in the Shreveport-Bossier area. You are widely known as a wonderful meditation teacher. Kind of taking a hiatus right now, writing your new book. We'll talk about that too. But how would you help our listeners understand if they have not experienced meditation? How do we begin to help someone understand what it is and what it's for?
Well, I mean, I think not to be difficult, but I think that even the questions kind of demonstrates why we need meditation so much in the sense that, I mean, literally it's sitting on a pillow doing nothing or sitting in a chair doing nothing.
Right.
And we can complicate that to even such a degree that we require an explanation for it or something.
Right.
At the end of the day, meditation really doesn't have to be churched up any more than just sitting there and just being present, being with your breath, being with your body, being literally with the contents, with the details of this very moment.
Right. Why is it so important, especially for us in the modern West, to understand and to learn and to know about meditation?
Well, I think so often our minds are running 90 to nothing that we're entirely we entirely overlook what's going on right here, right now. And
Right.
when you pay attention, you realize that is where your life is unfolding. There is
Right.
no life apart from this moment. And so to not be here is to not be alive, effectively.
Right. Right. How did you get started with meditation? How did you get on this path that you've been on? You've been studying both contemplative Christianity and Buddhism the last 15 years. How did you get started?
By not being alive. And so
It's funny, you look very alive.
yeah. Well, I mean, I came to meditation for the same reason everybody comes to meditation. I mean, at the end of the day, nobody ever just jumps up and says, I need to do more sitting on a pillow doing nothing. And so there's always suffering that brings people to that practice. It's always people who are stressed out, anxious, angry, afraid, and they're just looking to settle down. They just want to have a good day. They want to relax. And I came to meditation practice for the same reasons. I came because I was hyperactive. I came because I was getting in a lot of trouble. I got involved in meditation when I was 17 years old. And it really was, I was on medication. I didn't like the effects of the medication, and I wanted to discontinue it. But the problem was, somebody came to me and said, well, if you're going to quit taking that medication, it would be irresponsible to quit taking it and not substitute it with something else. I mean, if you were put on the medication for a reason. If you're going to quit taking it, you need to do something to address those causes and conditions. And so they gave me a book about Buddhist meditation, and I just started thumbing through it, and I didn't understand a damn word of it.
Yeah.
And then, it's a very small book. It's probably less than 100 pages, like a pamphlet, really.
Right.
And got to page probably 50 or 60, and there was just a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is how you meditate. And that was about the only thing in the whole book I understood. It was just, sit there with your shoulders pulled back, your back straight, your chin and neck form a 90-degree angle, looking straight forward with your eyes at a half gaze and your arms resting comfortably in your lap, and bring your awareness to the breath. And, I followed those instructions. And initially I thought, I'm a natural at this. And
Okay.
it felt like I was doing so great. And I was sitting
Yeah.
there for like 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I thought there's no way anybody's doing this for more than 2 or 3 minutes. And the fact that I'm able to accomplish this in my first go at it, I must really be a natural.
You must really be good.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
felt like a whole lot more than 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so over time, I began to realize, like, I far from being a natural, I actually struggled quite a bit with it. My mind
Right.
was so hyperactive. I could convince myself to get up for. I never had any interest in doing laundry before, and then suddenly I would sit down to meditate. My mind would start to tell me it's time to get some laundry done.
Yeah.
And so I'd be wanting to get up and go do all that. And, sitting there for 5 minutes initially was, it felt like an Olympic feat. And, but I stuck with it. And eventually 5 minutes became 7 minutes, and 7 minutes, 10 minutes. And, just kept growing and growing and growing until, turned out or rounded out into a full practice.
Mm-hmm. And we should say, there are people monks and both Christian contemplatives and Buddhist who meditate for long periods of time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, like, I wasn't born, I'm not some Tibetan tulku who was born out in, rural Tibet and brought into a monastery and raised from a kid, from the age of a young child to be a meditation master. I was
Right.
somebody who got kicked out of middle school because I couldn't stay out of trouble and got put on medication and all this stuff.
Right.
And initially my first, experience with meditation was, like I said, 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes, and, I'm sweating bullets.
Right.
And, it seems like a long time, I suppose, but in reality, 10 or 15 years isn't that long. And then, 10, 12 years later, I'm doing 30-day meditation
retreats. Yeah.
Staying out in the woods, meditating for weeks on end by myself. Not constantly, but as a retreat practice.
Right.
And it shows the potential that we have within ourselves. There was no way you could have convinced me back when I was 17 years old that I could go sit down anywhere for 2 weeks.
Right.
Not without being entirely unconscious. And so, there's a potential there that we're altogether unaware of, and we tell ourselves that we can't do it, we can't do it, we can't do it. We can do it. We really can, and the benefits of doing it and just sticking with it are great, and we'll be happy that we stuck with the practice.
What are some of those benefits that, if you would spell them out for us?
Well, I think initially, first and foremost, the mind just settles. And maybe that doesn't sound like a huge deal, but, when you are sitting there and you can't catch a break, even when there's nobody around you, because your mind's just winding you tighter and tighter and tighter,
Well, from a psychotherapist point of view, I think, Carla, you can weigh in on this also. I know that, and I include myself in this, I know many times I'm a slave to my own thoughts instead of, I think it needs to be the other way around. My thoughts need to serve me. But for many of us, I don't think that's the way it works. And if I really do observe my thoughts and I back up from that and look at them, I would if I'm judging me by my thoughts or evaluating me by my thoughts, I'm freaking crazy.
It's a dangerous neighborhood up in there.
Exactly. So, I think I want to be in charge of my thoughts instead of letting my thoughts be in charge of me. Is that something that you could say that meditation has done for you, to put you in charge of your thinking?
Yeah, there are different forms of meditation, and I was primarily trained within the Buddhist tradition, and most everything I've learned comes either from Buddhist meditation or contemplative Christianity, and both of them take a similar approach to meditation practice, which is really more interested in putting some space between us and our thoughts rather than trying to control the content of thought. And the way that
Just a witness, in other words, just
Yeah.
to witness thinking.
And to notice the space between our thoughts and reality. I mean, I think so often we confuse what we think with reality and then make decisions based on this hallucination for all intents and purposes. And
Right.
so, like, somebody does something we don't like, cuts us off in traffic, says something we don't like, and when we have a thought, jerk. And the emotion coupled with the speed, the intensity of our thinking mind solidifies that perception, and we can't see the difference between who that person really is. A father, a husband, a wife, a mother, a friend, a daughter. That
Right.
person exists independent of what we think of them.
Right.
But we can't see that. All we can
Right.
see is what we think of them, and so
Right.
we treat them like a jerk.
Right.
And that has consequences for us and for them.
Yeah.
But what happens is your mind slows down and you begin to put a little bit of space between what you think and reality. What happens is not that your mind quits saying jerk. Your mind still says jerk.
Okay.
You just see that jerk and the person that concept's
Are-
being
are-
hurled out are two
Are
different things.
Two different things, yeah. And I
Yeah.
don't have to necessarily put them together then.
Yeah. No, they're in fact they're just literally two different things.
Right.
They're not connected to one another unless we connect them. And the other thing too about meditation practice is that it does not bring you to some permanent plateau where you're just forever and always separated from your thoughts. I mean, it's more a reprieve, and we really do have to keep at it. If I let my practice slip, it's not so quick that my mind retreats to that old tendency of solidifying those thoughts and projecting them onto others.
But
and
it will get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it will get there. We're talking with the author of Finding God in the Body. His name is Benjamin Riggs. It's a spiritual path for the modern West, and we'll come back. We'll learn more about meditation from Ben Riggs. We'll talk about this wonderful book. It is a good book. You've written a good book, Ben.
Thank you.
And we'll be back to talk about it, as well as the coming book here on Strategies with Benjamin Riggs. Be right back. Welcome back. Welcome back into Strategies for Living, 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Marriage and family therapist David McMillan, PLPC Carla McCormick. Our life strategist this evening, the author of Finding God in the Body, A Spiritual Path for the Modern West. He's Benjamin Riggs, and you can find him at findinggodinthebody.com. Now, new book, and as I said, this is really a good book. It truly is. First-time authors sometimes, don't hit a home run, but you hit a home run right out of the chute, Ben.
Well, I appreciate that.
And now you're working on a second book.
Yes.
And it's coming out in December.
January 31st.
So,
January 1st.
January 1st okay. So that'll be about 3 years since the release of Finding God in the Body. Now, what are we looking forward to here? What's coming in the new year?
So the book is titled Triumph of Principles, The Story of American Spirituality in 12 Steps.
Whoa.
And actually work for one of y'all's sponsors, CADA.
Mm-hmm.
I do spirituality education groups for them, and I started doing that years ago.
Right.
When I got back from India, started teaching meditation. I was looking for opportunities to do that. I reached out to them, knew someone who worked for them, and they gave me the opportunity to start teaching the clients, basic spirituality and meditation. And in some shape, way, form, or fashion, I've been doing that with them ever since. And so, I have a familiarity with the 12 steps as a result. And I've always been intrigued by them. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know that I've seen a more practical system of Western spirituality than the 12 steps. I mean, Buddhism's very practical, but a lot of the
in one sense, I mean, we think of Buddhism as a religion, and yet Buddhism is really a way of life, and I suppose you could be and people are Christian and do Buddhist practice, or Jewish and do Buddhist practice, because Buddhism, strictly speaking, is a way of living, a way of approaching life, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, I was actually talking or either thinking, I can't remember which, with someone the other day, or either myself, about this very topic, and it seems to me that when people say Buddhism isn't really a religion as much as it is a way of life, what they're really getting at is that Buddhism places emphasis on process rather than outcome. Okay. And so they're less propositional in the way that they approach religion and spirituality. There aren't these... they're less interested in getting you to buy in on certain ideas than they are getting you to buy in on the process or the practices, which comes back to what I meant by it's practical. And in the West, Buddhism is seen as even more practical than it really is when you go to the East, because a lot of what we have in the West is, if you're interested in Buddhism, then I think it almost goes without saying, as a Westerner, if you're interested in Buddhism and you live like me in Shreveport, Louisiana, then there obviously was some dissatisfaction with Christianity. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been shopping around. Right. And so typically, what people are dissatisfied with are the supernatural and the propositional elements of their native religion when they start shopping from the East. And so what people who translate and write books about Buddhism and all that stuff do is they often weed out the supernatural elements of it before you ever get your hands on it. So what you would call Western Buddhism is really just Buddhism that agnostic and atheistic people have translated and sort of adapted for their Western modern audience, when in reality, when you go over to the East, it's every bit as supernatural as anything we have in the West. Okay. But it's just a pure system. I've never seen anything like the 12 steps it's almost entirely practical. Right. There are no theological propositions that anyone is forced to subscribe to. It leaves it open-ended for everyone to choose what works best for them.
The God of your understanding.
Yeah, exactly. And so I decided, I thought, well, this will be a relatively easy thing to just sit down and write. I can just sort of hammer this out. And what happened was sat down, started writing, and the book kind of morphed over time, where it wasn't just like a commentary on each of the 12 steps, which is what I initially intended to do. It became sort of like, well, that's an interesting idea. Where did that come from? Oh, that came from William James. Where did he get it? Oh, his godfather, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I began to realize, like, there's this sort of tapestry of American philosophy,
that uniquely have come together in the 12 steps.
Yeah, it's almost as if you go back to Benjamin Franklin, who, for example, the way that people talk about the insanity of alcoholism, Benjamin Franklin has this quote that, it's almost like it's just encapsulates all of it. He says, so useful is it to be a rational creature because it enables us to rationalize anything. And that's just sort of like the alcoholic insanity in a nutshell. But that practical, that very pragmatic way of seeing the world, he's often called the first American, and I think you could say that he kind of invented American philosophy, or the way that we think. It over time evolved and became more and more precise. And certainly if Franklin invented it, well, then Ralph Waldo Emerson set the tone. But then by the time it gets to William James, it's codified. William James sits down, takes ideas from Charles Sanders Peirce, and he actually formulates them into a philosophy, or his version of pragmatics. And William James' pragmatism, I think, is the quintessential American philosophy. And it's almost as if the 12 steps, which are heavily influenced by James's philosophy, particularly the book Varieties of Religious Experience. The author of the book Alcoholics Anonymous read that in one of the most formative periods of his life. And so that pragmatism heavily influences the 12 steps. And I think you could argue that American philosophy culminates with, at least in the realm of spirituality, the systemization of American pragmatism as a spiritual path in the 12 steps. And that's I'm trying to retell that story in the book.
That's where you're headed.
Yeah, and then in trying to weave all of that in with practical commentary for people who actually want to utilize the steps in their life as well, and having to lift that from the domain of alcoholism and drug addiction exclusively and make it available to everyone.
I can't wait. So, I don't usually say January, get here in a hurry, but can't wait for your book.
We talk about that constantly. I work in addiction too. So people who come a lot of times into, our halls, so to speak, and once they get into their recovery a little bit, often say, why isn't everybody doing this? If we practice like the principles of AA, and we practice this instead of the religions that we know, the world would be a better place. So the fact that you're kind of doing that, what people say, is kind of exciting to me, because I think that it is something that people who don't understand AA and don't even understand addiction don't realize what those principles are and how spiritual they can be, and how much growth you can get just separate and apart from addiction. Is that where you're
Oh, yeah,
going?
absolutely, yeah. And in fact, there's James Woods, and is it James Garner, starred in the movie My Name is Bill W.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And so they more or less tell the story of how these two co-founders met. And it really is just sort of an amazing thing when you sit back and think about some busted up businessman from New York who's going to Akron to try to take over a small little rubber company because he's tired of being embarrassed by the fact that his wife's paying all the bills and he can't get a job.
Right.
He's been sober for about 6 months, and then he goes out to Akron, Ohio on business, and there's a proctologist out there who is constantly drunk. There's a joke going around town that when you go see Dr. Bob Smith, you bet your ass because you're literally putting it on the table with him. And so, you got these two guys, and somehow, and it's interesting because Bill Wilson goes into this bar at the Mayflower Hotel in downtown Akron after the business deal he went there to execute falls through. He goes and he's starting to think, well, I think he's enticing himself with a ginger ale, and then finally realizes what he really wants. And so he goes to this church directory and calls someone, and all this is recounted in that Bill W. movie and all that.
Right.
It's sort of the origin story for Alcoholics Anonymous. And, it's really a series of seemingly very, very, very simple circumstances that lead to really extraordinary outcomes. Dr. Bob, he knows this whole save my soul, all that. He's been through that before. He knows exactly what's going on. Doesn't want to have that meeting. Only agrees to go because it's a friend of his wife.
Right.
And after she promises him no more than 15 minutes.
Right.
And so they go up there and they meet together, him and this Bill guy, and they come out 6 hours later. He agreed to 15 minutes, and he's there for 6 hours.
6 hours.
But really, the part of that story that's never told is it's almost as if the James Gardner, James Woods story just kind of ends right there, as if just to say, done deal.
Right.
He drank again. He went every year. Dr. Bob went every year to the American Medical Association conference in Atlantic City.
Mm-hmm.
And he left, I think it was just a couple of weeks later, and he drank again on the way there.
Mm-hmm.
The reason, when he came back, Bill was upset with him and was going to go back to New York. And when he came back, Bill and Bob's wife convinced Bill to stay and help sober him up because they needed him to be able to perform a surgery so they could pay the mortgage. Bill sympathized with her and stayed. But what ends up happening is Bob gets dropped off at the hospital to perform that surgery and looks at Bill and says, I'm going to follow through. What he meant was, I'm going to actually do the things I have to do. I'm going to go sit down and make a list of my handicaps. I'm going to go back and make amends to people. I'm going to start praying and meditating. I'm going to start doing all these things. He followed through.
That's the beginning. Yeah.
And that's really you have the moral of the story about two people suffering, speaking and sharing this language of the heart. And that's an important piece of it, but it's not the only piece, and what they learned in that second half is that, action's the coin and trade. And to me, that's what distinguishes AA spirituality from anything else we see in the West, is that what you think
puts it into action.
Yeah, what you think or what you believe is of far less consequence than what you do.
What you do. And the 12 steps is really about doing. When we come back from this break, there's a lot of places we could go. Finding God in the body is rich. But Ben, one of the things that you do is you explore that space between fundamentalism and atheism. Let's tackle that when we come back here on Strategies.
Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier.
Build me a buttercup? What? Okay, now you're going to have to explain to me. Ruben,
They don't always have to mean something. I just like this song.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fine.
I like that song
I like
too,
the song
Ruben.
too. So I'm with you. Welcome back to Strategies for a Living, 101.7 FM at 710 Keel. And you never know what Rapid Ruben Wright is coming up with next. But he's always good for a surprise or two during the show. Another reason to tune into Strategies for a Living, as is PLPC Carla McCormick. And I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. We are we're talking to Benjamin Riggs today. He's the author of a very good book, Finding God in the Body. You can order it wherever you order books. You can also order it directly from findinggodinthebody.com. I think you linked to Amazon or
Yeah, it's
one of those.
available on Amazon.
So, Ben, you in the book you address the stages, each stage of our journey, and you explore in that kind of in the middle of the book, the very heart of the book, you explore this space between fundamentalism and atheism in order to bring about or uncover a spirituality that may resonate better with the Western mind. Talk a little bit about what you're doing here.
Well, I mean, honestly, a lot of it's my story. I mean, so it's something that I've had to grapple with. Like earlier, I said, if you're looking at Buddhism,
Right.
and you live in Shreveport, Louisiana, then you're obviously dissatisfied with Christianity. At the time, that would have been, like, in my opinion, an absolute dissatisfaction. So what I mean by that is if you'd come up to me and been like, are you dissatisfied with Christianity? I would have told you, yeah. It's just, not a very good system of spirituality or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
And now I understand that was a very limited perspective. Like, it was a very
Right.
limited take. I remember buying a book at I was reading a book by the Dalai Lama, and he says there was this Westerner that was the most whole and complete Westerner he'd ever met. And I thought, well, that's a ringing endorsement coming
Was he
from the
talking
Dalai
about Thomas Merton?
He was talking about Merton.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, Thomas Merton sounds a whole lot more accessible than Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And so I'll go buy one of these Merton books, and so I can have a Westerner explaining Buddhism to me.
Right.
So I go buy this book, and I was with my girlfriend at the time, and she was shopping. And so I thought, well, I'll just use this opportunity, and I'll sit out in my truck, and I'll read
A
the
little bit of
book,
Merton. Yeah.
and she can go shop. And so got to page 9, and this man uses the C word. And I thought, what is this Buddhist talking about Christ for? And, but up until that point, he had lit my mind on fire.
Right.
I'd never heard anybody talk this way. He was the most insightful and articulate. Like,
Which
he was
Merton book did you get?
There's No Man is an Island.
No Man's an Island. Okay.
And he was just pushing all the right buttons. And I thought there's no man from whom God had hidden less than this guy. Like, he had it all figured out. And and then he said that C word, and I thought, well, I'm done with him. But I couldn't walk away from it.
Right.
Like, I just kept
He had
coming
hooked
back
you.
to it. Yeah,
He
and I
hooked you.
started to realize there's this whole other side to Christianity that I'd just never been exposed to in Shreveport.
Yeah.
And so that started this kind of attempt to reconcile my Western spirituality with my preferences for the very practical approach that I'd seen in the East.
You quote at the beginning of this chapter one of my heroes, Scott Peck.
Oh, okay.
Turned my world upside down. He wrote The Road Less Traveled in, I think, 79. I found it right around 80, 85, 86, somewhere in there. Anyway, the Scott Peck quote that you use, if you desire wisdom greater than your own, you can find it inside of you. What this suggests is that the interface between God and man is at least in part the interface between the unconscious and our conscious. To put it plainly, our unconscious is God, God within us. if the reader is horrified by the idea that our unconscious is God, he or she should recall that the idea is hardly a heretical concept, being in essence the same as the Christian concept of the Holy Ghost or the Holy Spirit, which resides in us all.
Yeah, in fact, I take the title of the book from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians when he says, do you not know that your body is a temple? Well, if you really place that in the context in which he's speaking, so he's a first century Jew. When he says temple, he means the house of God, that this is where God actually lives. So what he says is, do you not know that God actually lives in your body? You know, and he's talking to Jews in the diaspora, so he's saying, you know, God doesn't live in Jerusalem in that brick and mortar temple. He lives in your body.
Right.
And so I don't even find what Scott Peck says there, or, you know, I labor to explain in that book. I don't find either of them concepts at all even remotely new or revolutionary, to be honest with you. I mean, I think it's kind of funny that we've hid them from ourselves and we're now all pretending as, you know, and that's what we're doing. What people would consider like liberal theology is really just something Paul said 2,000 years ago.
Liberal theology is not so new, in other words.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's old school, huh?
Yeah. But, you know, again, many of us don't think this way, or perhaps think of Paul, but Paul was perhaps the first great theologian, you know, and maybe the greatest theologian, Christian theologian.
Arguably more influential than Jesus.
I was going to say, I mean, you know, arguably without Paul, we don't have the spread of the Jesus message. So, I know with all, you know, due respect, we call our religion Christianity, but I often say maybe we should call it Paulianity if we really understood the influence that this man, Paul of Tarsus, really had.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's probably one of the most influential people in Western history.
What after you finished the Merton book, what did it change you?
Oh, certainly, yeah. In fact, I decided that I wanted to go to a Buddhist monastery maybe a year later.
You read a Christian contemplative book and you decide it's sending you to a Buddhist monastery.
Well, what happened was I knew a Franciscan friar. Told him I was interested in going to a Buddhist monastery. He told me he knew of a Franciscan friary that was a retreat, a hermitage, and it shared a property with a Trappist monastery, which is the order to which Merton belonged. Right. And so he said, well, before you go to India and start, you know, trying to live in a monastery there, perhaps you should try it out in the United States and go to this Franciscan friary and spend some time at this Trappist monastery and see if you like it. And so, you know, had I not read Merton, I never would have stepped foot on that property. But he certainly not only opened my mind to it, but made me excited about the prospects. And then I got there and I met the most whole and complete people I'd ever known. Yeah, there was also a Catholic hermitage there for nuns, and these women, I remember I showed up. They all literally lived as hermits and lived by themselves in like little cabins, and they made rosaries from deer bones they found in the woods. Wow. And I come walking into the like mess hall. Right. And the priest who does their which is one of the problems I certainly have with Catholicism, but this priest is there to give them communion. Right. And he tells me that one of them wanted to wish me well on my travels to India. Wow. And I thought, well, thank you. And later I was talking to the Franciscans, and I said, when did y'all talk to the hermits? When did y'all tell them that I was going to India? They said, we haven't talked to them people. And so, you know, these were very, this was a...
Talk about
a class of people I don't know. Yeah. I'd never met before.
Yeah. Wow. Benjamin Riggs, the book is Finding God in the Body. It's a spiritual path for the modern West. www.findinggodinthebody.com. More with Ben in just a moment. on Strategies. Now you're talking. Now you're talking. Welcome back into Strategies for Living, 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Strategies for Living. Ruben's on fire tonight, as is PLPC Carla McCormick, marriage and family therapist David McMillan, and our wonderful guest, the author of Finding God in the Body, Mr. Benjamin Riggs.
Hey, so Ben, as we finish up, is this a book for beginners? Is this a book for people like me who will never go to a Buddhist monastery, who will never travel the world? Is this an instruction manual for me to start my spiritual kind of awakening, or just new journey or interest?
Yeah, so certainly is a book for people who will never go to a Buddhist monastery. The two things I'd say about that is that my experience and my way of thinking now, I prefer the spirituality that's more engaging in the world. That's another reason I like that intrigued me about the 12 steps.
Right.
But they're very engaging. They're very rooted and planted in this world. Absolutely, it's not about how do we shelter our minds and hide away and have this sort of cloistered serenity, but how do we have a serenity that can go with us into everything that we do? How can we have serenity at Brookshire's, in our relationships, when we're by ourselves in traffic, when we meet the jerk? Like
Right.
that's ultimately when we need it. And if
Right.
our spirituality doesn't bring it to us in that moment, then our spirituality is as dry as dust. And so that's one of the,
Well
that's,
said.
that's one of the points that I certainly try to address in the book. As far as the beginner element goes, I believe that the book starts where all spirituality begins, which is suffering. But I try to take it there to the the deepest spiritual truth that I would felt capable of articulating. And so I try to span the whole path. And it is a book that is written for someone who is serious. They don't have to be a PhD and they don't have to be a monk to read it, but it's a book for someone who is serious about their spiritual.
Be ready to engage.
Yeah.
You did a great job. Folks, you got to get a copy of Finding God in the Body. Ben, you've got to come back and see us again. We've got more programs to do with you.
I'd certainly like to come back in January and bring the
Okay.
new book.
Well, you're definitely coming back
Super
then. Yeah.
interesting. I'm going to be ordering the book tonight.
In the meantime, folks, go if you haven't found your copy of Finding God in the Body, you need to go get it. FindingGodInTheBody.com is another way to continue the conversation with Ben Ricks. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate you. Folks, thank you for tuning in to Strategies for Living. We've been brought to you by CADA, the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse of Northwest Louisiana, helping individuals and families for 60 years now. Also by Milestones Counseling Center, by Jerry Anderson State Farm Insurance, by Learning RX, by Highland Place Rehab and Nursing Center, by Jacob's Well, Inspirational Books and Gifts, and by Resilient House. If today were the last day of your life, you only had one more phone call to make, who would you call? What would you say? And why are you waiting? Make the call. For Reuben Wright, for PLPC Carla McCormick, and for Benjamin Riggs, I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. See you next time here on Strategies for Living.
This is 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. KEEL, Shreveport.